for joining us today. My name is Keith Larson, and I'm the president of the Louisville Forum. The Forum typically meets on the second Wednesday of every month at Vincenzo's downtown Louisville. While today we're meeting by Zoom, next month, July 20th, we will be resuming our in-person meetings. The Louisville Forum is a nonpartisan public issues group founded in 1984. We host debates and discussions of current and sometimes controversial public issues that affect the greater Louisville community. For more information on the forum, or if you're interested in becoming a member, please visit louisvilleforum.org. Our topic today is examining election reform in Kentucky with Secretary of State Michael Adams. At the end of March, Kentucky's General Assembly passed bipartisan voting reform that established days of early voting, introduced voting centers for more in-person ballot options, creates an online ballot request portal, and provides a process for voters to cure problems with their absentee ballots. Joining us today to help unpack these new laws and procedures, Secretary of State Michael Adams. Secretary Adams, a native of Paducah, is Kentucky's 86th Secretary of State and the 77th person to serve in that role. He was inaugurated on January 6, 2020 to serve in this capacity. Here to moderate our discussion and to help answer your questions is Renee Shaw. Ms. Shaw is the Director of Public Affairs and moderator of KET's Public Affairs Programming and Content. She currently serves as moderator of KET's Kentucky Tonight, Connections, Election Coverage, Legislative Update, and KET Forums. Since 2001, Renee has been the producing force behind KET's legislative coverage that's been recognized by the Kentucky Associated Press and the National Education Telecommunications Association. At this point, I'll turn the floor over to Secretary Adams for opening remarks. And then from there, Ms. Shaw, please feel free to jump in to questions. Thank you, Secretary Adams.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me today. I live in Louisville. I have for several years, and I've enjoyed attending Louisville Forum events. And it's great to visit with you all virtually. I look forward to visiting with you back at Vincenzo's soon. So I'm here today to talk about, among other things, House Bill 574. This is the most significant election reform measure to pass into Kentucky law, by my count, since 1891. Think about this for just a moment. The Kentucky election system, the rules, the process that I inherited when I was sworn in at the first of last year was written in 1891. In 1891, we didn't have cars. We didn't have electricity in homes. We didn't have suburbs. Pretty much everything that we have in our modern lives, our busy modern lives, we didn't have back then. We were long, long overdue to reassess our election system and try to accommodate it to modern reality. The reason we have a legislature, they could have written all the laws for everything back in 1891, but they didn't do that. Our framers of our Constitution provided for the legislature to come back first every 2 years and now every year and assess what can we improve in our governmental systems, how can we align them with current practices and procedures people follow in their lives. And we just hadn't done that with our elections. Through 130 years of inertia, we had an obsolete election model. So I'm really proud that I was able to offer, in essence, a pilot project in 2020. The things that I did administratively through powers I was granted on a temporary basis, along with the governor, for managing our election in a pandemic. We used those authorities to do things to make voting easier, obviously to make it safe as well, but to make voting easier, to accommodate voting in a pandemic. And most of those things actually proved so successful and so popular that there was demand to keep them after the pandemic was over and to make them permanent in elections in the future. Just very quickly, let me note that Kentucky, I think uniquely compared to other states, had a successful election by several different metrics. Number one, our turnout was through the roof. We actually had the highest turnout we've ever had in an election in Kentucky, over 2 million voters. Number two, we kept people safe. That wasn't a given. That's the thing that kept me up the most at night, and I think the governor too, is keeping people safe in a pandemic. Even in a pandemic, 70% of our voters chose to vote in person. That's our tradition here in Kentucky. We want to make sure they could do that safely. And I'm really proud that although you saw COVID spikes at other points last year in Kentucky around the holidays, you actually saw COVID spikes coming out of the elections in other states. Here in Kentucky, we didn't have that. And that's a testament to the great work that our county clerks did, and frankly, the great work our voters did in being patient and following the rules that we set out. And then finally, we had a secure election. There were irresponsible predictions that we were going to have vote fraud because of how easy we made it for people to vote in a pandemic. It just didn't materialize. We actually had fewer reports called into our election hotline than we normally have in a typical election, with everybody voting on one day and hardly any absentee voting. So we actually made the system more secure than it had been previously, but we didn't have to limit access to do it. And in fact, we expanded access and enhanced security simultaneously. And that special sauce is why Kentucky is the only state in America that has passed legislation this year to make it both easier to vote and harder to cheat. Other states have gone in a different direction, and frankly, so has Washington, D.C. But Kentucky, I'm just so proud to be the chief election official of a state that's really figured this out and done it the right way. Let me quickly give you 4 things that we did last year through emergency powers that in some respect we have now made permanent in this bill. The first is early voting. I'd say this is the most popular and the most significant change that we've made in this bill. It used to be, and by the way, I've been involved in elections for about 30 years. I started running campaigns when I was a teenager before I was old enough to vote, and I've monitored this over time. Every election I was involved in from the early 90s and through the one I ran in 2019, about 2% of voters voted by absentee ballot, about 98% voted in person on one day in a 12-hour span. After I got sworn in, I offered a bill in the legislature to expand our in-person voting hours, not by days or weeks, by 1 hour. I asked to extend the polling hours to 7 p.m. on election day. I can't even get that heard, let alone passed and signed into law. That's how far we've come in Kentucky in a year. Now the debate was over how many days of voting we added to that. This bill has 3 days of early voting, the Thursday, Friday, Saturday, before election day, or now days people will be able to go vote without any sort of excuse required. This really matches what we saw last year, a big spike in turnout those last few days before election day. That's when people make up their minds about how they're going to vote. We didn't want this to be unduly expensive. This stuff is very expensive. If you have weeks and weeks of voting, that really hikes the costs. Last year, we had generous subsidies from Congress to pay for our election costs in the pandemic, and we don't have that anymore. So we had to come up with something manageable. But I think 3 days is the right answer. And that's something the clerks were comfortable with, something that Democrats and Republicans in the legislature were comfortable with. If we need more days in the future, then we should come back and add more. But I do think, at least going forward, those 3 extra days will be a significant improvement. And my expectation is it'll take an election or two to sink in and for word of mouth to really get out there. But I do think that you'll see higher turnout in Kentucky. Once this is implemented over the next 2 or 3 elections, you'll really see a bump in the turnout. The next thing is the vote centers. This is a little technical. I'll keep it simple. What you had in our election in Jefferson County, for example, last year was fewer locations, but locations that were far more convenient, that were just designed better for voting, that had more parking, that were more easily accessible to more people. And to be clear, I don't advocate going from 200 precincts to one place to vote, or 2 or 8 or 20 for that matter. But I do think it's good to have fewer locations that are better locations. Number one, the voters actually liked it better, including me. When I voted in 2016, under the old rules, I had to wait in line for 3.5 hours to vote in Jefferson County. No knock on anyone, that's just the way it worked. When I voted last year at a vote center, it only took 30 minutes to get in and out of the line. So vote centers are more efficient, moving people in and out. They also, and this is significant, they require fewer poll workers and fewer election machines to have the same throughput of voters. And that saves the counties quite a bit of money, and it saves a big headache on the part of the county clerks in trying to recruit the poll workers, which is getting increasingly hard as our elderly age out of that process and aren't being replaced by younger people volunteering to be poll workers. Just to give you a sense of scope, I was in Boyle County, Danville, a couple of weeks ago. They're going to save $200,000 under this bill with the capacity to do vote centers because they need fewer machines and fewer poll workers. And still, they'll cut the length of time to vote. So Jefferson, Lord knows how much Jefferson could save. We've not got that assessment yet, but probably a lot. The third thing is the absentee ballot request and tracking portal. I think this is the most significant thing that we did administratively last year. We used to have no real sense of how many, at the Frankfurt level, no sense of how many absentee ballots have been requested or sent out or received back or counted or not counted. There just really wasn't much surveillance of that part of our election, unlike the in-person part, which is very closely scrutinized by election officials. And the voters didn't really know what was going on either. Most of my career, I've voted absentee. I rarely get to go vote on election day. I'm usually traveling. And so I remember always calling the clerk and asking, hey, did you get my ballot? Was it counted? I wanted to know. With the portal, we have full transparency. The voter can go online 24/7 and track her ballot. You can't track someone else's, just yours. But you can track that your request was received. You can track that your ballot was sent out. You can track that your ballot was received back and counted. We've got a radical level of transparency here that will reduce the call volume on the clerks, but also just make the voters feel more secure that their voice is being heard in this election. It also allows me and our law enforcement partners, including federal prosecutors who look out for corrupt practices year after year in our elections. It allows us to actually monitor this election at the macro level and monitor for any lost or stolen ballots. And so that's a significant improvement for everybody. And then finally, the cure process. It used to be that if someone signed an absentee ballot envelope and that signature didn't match the signature that voter had signed on a voter registration card 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago, that vote would just be thrown out with no notice to that voter, no transparency, no appeal, no nothing, just thrown in the garbage. It's absurd. I've got 3 grandparents still alive. They registered to vote in the 50s. I'd be outraged if their signature looked different today in their 80s than it did when they were in their teens or 20s, and their vote got thrown out because of it with no prior notice. So now, if there is a mismatched signature, instead of just rejecting that ballot, the voter is contacted and given a chance to demonstrate identity. That's important for access and enfranchising voters. It's also important for security, because if someone isn't that voter who signed that ballot envelope, I want to know about it. I want to run that trail down and see if there was some sort of impersonation of that voter. So these are things that are best practices that I've been exposed to in the many years that I was an election lawyer in private practice, working in campaigns all across the country, seeing how other states did what they did. And I saw a lot of great things that I thought we should import to Kentucky. And of course, it took a crisis for us to have the opportunity to be able to do that and overcome that inertia. But I think this is at least one silver lining that we've seen coming out of the pandemic. So with that summary, thanks again for this platform. I look forward to Renee's questions and yours as well.
Thank you, Secretary Adams. It's always a pleasure to be with you. We've had these conversations many times, and even this time last year, we were talking about how the primary was going to be conducted on June 22nd or 23rd. So it's good to see you and to have this conversation again to follow up on House Bill 574. I want to start with one of the other provisions that I don't know if you mentioned about requiring counties to gradually phase out the electronic only voting systems. Okay, can you talk about that and why that's important to ensure that there is a paper trail? And what does giving a paper trail do to maybe boost the public confidence in the electoral voting process?
Oh, yeah, thank you for that great question. So there were 4 things that I did last year that were made permanent, but there were some new things in the bill as well. This one is maybe the most important. I worked really hard running for this office against a pretty tough opponent. I drove 50,000 miles. I did 500 events in 107 counties. And there's one issue, every single place I went, I got this, and sometimes from Democrats, sometimes from Republicans, sometimes from independents. Everybody that I talked to more or less urged me to push away from electronic voting machines and go toward paper ballots. And I want to be extremely clear about this. There are fringe elements on both sides that think that our machines in Kentucky and machines elsewhere are being hacked. In 2016, there were a lot of Democrats that believed that Hillary Clinton won the election and it was stolen from her by Russia via hacking of our machines, not Kentucky's necessarily, but machines in other states. And in truth, there were attempts by Russia or by Russian actors to get into voter registration databases. They tried that here too in 2016. They weren't successful. But getting into the voter registration database and getting into the machines are two totally different things. And again, they did get into the registration system, but they can't get into the machines. They're not on the internet. There's no way to hack into them. And then 3 years later, in a very close election for governor, a lot of Republicans thought that Andy Beshear stole the election and that the machines either were hacked or malfunctioned in a way that disadvantaged Matt Bevin from being reelected. And I think that is equally hogwash. I actually personally stood with my predecessor and signed off on the recanvass. And I believe thoroughly that we had a fair election in Kentucky in both of those elections. And I've seen no evidence to the contrary. But I'm also a realist. I also understand that all day, every day, I've got to combat misinformation. But the bottom line is people feel more secure voting on a piece of paper than they do on an electronic machine. And I do too. And here's my personal interest in having paper ballots. I'm the guy whose job it is to go do a recount. We've got a recount. I can't do a recount if we don't have ballots to go count. If we just have electronic machines, I can't recount those. I just hit the button, they say the same number. That's not a recount. A recount is when you actually pull the ballots out and count them. And we don't have that capacity, or at least we didn't. In 2018, we had a state rep race that was literally a tie. And we weren't able to really, this is before my time, but we weren't able to assess, we'll never really know who won that election because we couldn't do a recount because Davis County used electronic machines. When I took office last year, we had 29 counties that were not capable of processing any paper ballots at all. Today, all 120 counties have at least some paper ballot capacity. Our team worked really hard last year to help counties upgrade their equipment. We went out and got them federal grants. But even though all counties have some paper, some have a mix of paper and electronic. One of my goals is to go universally to paper, and that's in this bill. This bill does not have an immediate mandate. There's a grandfather clause. It doesn't make any county drop what they're doing and go out and spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on new equipment. But it does say that when you do upgrade, it might be now, it might be next year, it might be 2 years, but when you do it, you're going to upgrade to paper ballot equipment. That will look like one of two machines, probably both at every precinct. One is just simply a counter. And those of you who are roughly my age, you took Scantron tests in high school, little bubble sheets, multiple choice. It'll be that kind of technology. It's just a counter. It's not plugged in anywhere other than the wall for electricity. It counts a paper ballot where you've marked your choices. The other kind of machine looks like an electronic machine, but it's merely a printer. It's not a voting machine. When you hit the button for your ballot, when you're done, it doesn't vote your ballot. It prints your ballot. And then you get to look at it and make sure it's right. And if it's not, you can tear it up and print another one. And then you run that through the same machine that the people are running their other ballots through. So every single ballot will be printed or handwritten. But either way, it'll be fully ADA compliant for people who can't use their hands, or maybe they have Parkinson's, or they, for whatever reason, they can't fill out a ballot by hand. They can use those machines to print. But in any event, every ballot will be paper. I've been voting in Jefferson County for many years, and that's what we moved to about 4 years ago, and I love it. Several counties have done that, and that's kind of been our model for the ideal election, is to have that type of technology.
A question about in-person early voting. As you mentioned, almost this time last year, it was like 3 weeks, right, that we were allowed to vote in person. Of course, now 574 whittles that down to 3 days. And you said, as you said, the Thursday, Friday, and Saturday before Election Day. The wisdom in carving out fewer days. If 2 to 3 weeks worked for people, we had more than 2 million people who voted in 2020. Why whittle it down from the 20-something days to the 3? What was the wisdom behind that?
Sure. Well, to add some perspective, we went from 1 day in the law to 4 days in the law. What we did last year was done through emergency powers. The legislature never voted to approve any of that. I took actually a lot of heat from the legislature for doing that, and I stand by what I did. But the idea wasn't let's have unlimited election periods because it'll make things slightly easier for people. The idea was let's save lives. We were trying to ensure social distancing, and we thought that having 2 weeks to vote in person in the primary and 3 weeks in the general election would ensure that we didn't have lines at the polling sites. Or if there were lines, we'd still be able to have people 6 feet apart and not have people backed up for miles and miles. And so we weren't doing that to ensure convenience. Convenience is good to some point, but there is a point of diminishing returns. We saw somewhat light turnout really for the entire 2 weeks in the primary during the early voting, and then most of the early voting period in the general. We saw a big spike in the days right up going into the election. So our thought process again is, well, look, this time we don't have a grant from Congress to pay for these elections. We got $12.5 million from Congress last year. I don't have another $12.5 million to spend on elections to make things slightly more convenient to have unlimited days of voting. Money's finite. I actually get $0.00 from the legislature. All I had to live off of is a fee income from businesses that file once a year with my office. So I don't have the unlimited funds to offer unlimited services. But I do think, and what we saw last year is most people wait till the end. But it really helps them to have a Saturday. That makes a big difference. We thought the Saturday was the biggest improvement, and we threw in the Thursday and Friday too, because that matches how people actually voted when they voted. I just don't feel comfortable going to legislature and saying, take $10 million out of healthcare or education so I can have even more and more days for people to vote. How am I going to get the poll workers? I can barely get poll workers to work on one day, let alone 20 days. So I don't want people to think that we believe that weeks and weeks of voting should be the standard outside of a pandemic. That was done for public safety. And there are a lot of changes that we made last year because of a pandemic that we're not keeping permanently, and that would be one of them.
We had a question here about internet voting. Do you ever see a time where online voting could be secure and there'd be confidence in that? And would you be a proponent of such?
Absolutely not. I just don't think that's ever going to happen. It's not unprecedented. I was counsel in a gubernatorial race in Washington State in 2008, and they actually had internet voting at the time. They've gotten rid of it. They didn't feel it was secure. They've gone to unlimited mail-in voting. They thought that was more secure than internet voting, which is, I think, pretty telling. I don't think Kentuckians would stand for that. If you look at the backlash I took just for allowing absentee voting in a pandemic, I think you'd agree that moving toward the internet would not be a popular notion. I don't think people would utilize it. I don't think they would trust it. My goal is to enhance public confidence in our system. I don't think the internet voting would do that. If anything, states are moving away from the internet. They're moving away from any connection to the internet with their machines. We don't have any, we never have, but that's really the opposite direction that I think our state wants to go and the rest of the country wants to go.
As you mentioned, you did face some pretty stern backlash from even members of your own party. And so I'm curious, is what 574 did, or maybe other bills that didn't make it through the process, did any of them try to diminish the power of the Secretary of State's office?
Not really. I mean, one of the bills, Senate Bill 2, I think it was 1 or 2 in this last session, it undid the grant of emergency powers in part that I had gotten for the pandemic, but I didn't take that as a shot at me. I never asked for unlimited power. What I asked for in 2020 was temporary powers just to get us through the election, to be shared with the governor. And so in the course of the legislature re-examining emergency powers overall, they said, okay, well, this shouldn't be unlimited. This should be sunsetted. It was enacted for a specific situation. So I didn't really take that personally. What I said at the time was, well, look, it's the job of the legislature to make permanent decisions about the election system. And I'm proud of what I did administratively, but this is their decision on a permanent basis. When that election was over, my powers should expire and I should turn back into a pumpkin. That doesn't hurt my feelings. The big question, of course, was what are they going to do? If they're now exercising dominion over the election system, are they going to take our recommendations for what that should look like? And they took every single one of them. I'm real proud of that.
One of the things, as you mentioned, even your campaign slogan was making it easier to vote and harder to cheat. And you had also a focus on purging the voter rolls from inactive, even deceased folks or people who may have had residence in a couple of different states. Can you talk to that and the success you've had for that and the criticism that you've taken from that practice?
Yeah, thanks. I was threatened with a lawsuit on this the week I was elected, so I wasn't even in office yet. Let me start with this premise. Having accurate government records is a good thing. It's not beneficial to anybody, any appropriate benefit anyway, to have inaccurate records. I don't want people who are dead getting stimulus checks or unemployment checks. I don't want people who are dead being on our voter rolls either. This didn't used to be a partisan issue. When Wendell Ford, a Democrat, was governor 50 years ago, he actually got the state to throw the voter rolls in the garbage and pass a law and get everybody to have to re-register to vote because the rolls were such a mess, they were not even salvageable. When Wendell Ford went to Congress, when he was a U.S. Senator, one of the biggest bills he passed in his 4 terms was the National Voter Registration Act of 1993. And among other things, it required the states to regularly maintain their rolls on at least a biennial basis, remove people from their rolls who didn't belong on there anymore under the law. That bill passed a Democratic Congress and was signed by President Bill Clinton. So this used to not be a partisan issue. It shouldn't be, but unfortunately it has become ideological. In Kentucky, my predecessor was sued and lost in federal court and ultimately had to sign a federal consent decree that required her to come into compliance with the law. Our state had not followed the law. According to this judge's ruling, had not followed the law, had not regularly kept its rolls up to date. We had hundreds of thousands of people on our rolls that we knew it was not even disputed that they had moved away or passed away or been put away and were on our rolls. Well, number one, you're inviting fraud if you have these people on your rolls. And this isn't a speculative concern. There actually have been people indicted in other states, not here, but in other states for voting in the names of people who are dead. People are going to go to prison for this. It's a real problem. Here's another reason. It makes the lines longer. When the voter roll is larger than it should be because of all the inaccurate names, it takes that much longer for the poll worker to find the voter who shows up to vote on election day. So there's just really no interest in having voter rolls that are out of compliance. It violates the law and it makes everyone's job harder. So we've been very aggressive in getting the rolls cleaned up. We've had about half the months I've been here, we've taken more dead voters off the rolls than we've added live voters. That really is pretty telling about the mess that we inherited and the work that we've done to get this up to speed. But to be very clear, every single month we put out a detailed press release that explains what we're doing and why, who we took off and for what reason. We don't want anyone to think that we're trying to rig this in favor of my political party. If you look at who were taken off the rolls, it more or less reflects the rest of the proportional breakdown of party by voter registration. We're not taking all the Democrats off and leaving Republicans or something like that. We're being very transparent about it. I don't want people to be concerned, to doubt my integrity or the integrity of our system by thinking we're trying to rig the elections in favor of my party. So we're very transparent. Before we do any sort of mass purge of non-residents, which by the way, this is also in this bill, it enables me to more easily do that. Before we do that, we're going to proactively actually announce on our website who it is that we intend to take off. So if people are on that list and there's a mistake, we want them to tell us in advance so we don't take them off. So there's no sleight of hand here. We want to be fully transparent with Kentuckians.
A question from one of the participants, what will you do to ensure that voters who don't own private transportation can get to polls? This person asked because many citizens are too addicted to substances, too disabled, or too poor, or too green to own and operate cars. So public transportation is underfunded throughout the state. It's not available everywhere. Do you have a solution to that dilemma?
Well, no, with all due respect, that's not my job. If it were my job, then I would be accused of favoring one demographic over another demographic and trying to give these people rise to the polls and not those people. It's the job of the parties to give people transportation. Consistently, both political parties have offered free rides to the polls. And by the way, if you can't get to the polls, you can also vote absentee. We've made it easier than it's ever been before through the portal. But it just wouldn't be appropriate for the election official, especially one who's elected by party, to provide transportation to any subset of voters. Let the parties get out the vote. It's not my job.
And so for those who don't have adequate transportation, indicating that you don't have such transportation is a valid excuse to get an absentee ballot.
Well, it is if you can't get to the polls because you're disabled. There's about 10 or a dozen different excuses in the law for voting by absentee ballot. And so if you qualify for one of those, you're all set. If you live in the county and you're not disabled and you just don't have transportation, then call a friend or a relative. But if that doesn't work, call the Democratic Party, call the Republican Party. They will happily send someone to your home to give you a free ride to the polls. Actually, last year, I know in Louisville, for example, where I live, TARC offered free rides to the polls as well. So free rides to the vote center specifically. So I think you got lots of options, but it shouldn't be my role. I think that would be questionable ethically and politically if I were the one providing transportation for voters.
Another question from a participant: how do you keep campaigns from bearing the brunt of keeping voting data clean? Is that even the case? That campaigns
well, they don't
do that?
They don't really have a role. It's pretty restricted. I'll give you an example. I had a very gruff gentleman call us yesterday and demand to come up here and help us get the rolls cleaned up. It's not the role of the campaigns or this person who's an activist. This is the role of the government. It's the government's records, and it's the government's job to make sure they're accurate. So I've got a role. The State Board of Elections has a role. The clerks, we've all got a job to do, and we'll do it. But there's just not really a place for interested private actors like candidates to play a role in that.
You mentioned at the very top about what House Bill 574 does do, and here's some things that it doesn't do. It doesn't extend the voting hours beyond 6 p.m., and I think you're a proponent for making it an hour later, but is there not a constitutional remedy that has to go with that? That'd be my first question. There's no excuse mail-in voting, no expansion of lists who can vote absentee, not require multiple voting cities or centers in large counties, and it doesn't adjust the voter registration deadline. The current law sets that at 29 days before election. There is a question about that, more flexibility in that. So let's start with the first one about the deadline beyond 6 p.m. What's the rub giving one extra hour, and does it require more than a statutory fix to that for that to happen?
Well, I've assessed this as a constitutional attorney, and my legal opinion is I don't think that we do need to amend the Constitution. But people disagree on that. Actually, Governor Beshear has said publicly he thinks that an amendment would be necessary. I think it's ironic that it's clearly legal for them to expand the number of days, but to expand 1 hour on one day is a legal question that people can reasonably disagree on. But I'll tell you, here's the primary issue, the primary problem with getting an extra hour out on election day. It's because most of our poll workers are senior citizens, and they've got a long day as it is. And I say this as an advocate of expanding those hours. But the truth is, it's harder, believe it or not, it's harder to find 1 more hour in one day than it is to add 8 hours on each of 3 other days. Because if you're taking a day that wasn't a voting day and you're adding an 8-hour shift, that's actually easier than adding 1 more hour to a 12-hour shift. It's hard, gosh, to give you some perspective, it takes 15,000 poll workers. These are all volunteers. They don't work for me. I can't draft them. They're all volunteers. It takes 15,000 people to run an election. In our primary last year, we had 2,000 volunteers. We had thousands more than that, and they all canceled on us for obvious reasons. It's really hard to get poll workers. And the ones that we get primarily are senior citizens who come from an age and era of volunteerism and civic activism. And unfortunately, their kids and grandkids just don't have that same mentality. So getting poll workers is hard enough. If you tell a senior citizen that we're going to extend her day by 1 more hour, that's a deal breaker. The clerks are very, very much against expanding this by 1 more hour on election day. And I favor it as a policy, but I also understand their perspective of we're going to get the poll workers. You're just making it that much harder to find people if you're making their day 1 hour longer. These are elderly people. They're pretty tired at the end of a long day as it is, a 12-hour shift. And it doesn't even count the setup and the close down for the vote counting. So really it's like a 14-hour shift, and this would make it 15. So that's the policy reason why my attempt to get that passed last year ran aground, and I didn't try again this year. It's a lot harder than it sounds.
And to the question about adjusting the voter registration deadline, why not that? And even a participant asked, could there be more flexibility of party registration than 10 months before the elections where candidates aren't even known?
Yeah, actually, those are both things that I have asked the legislature for. The first one I asked for last year in a larger, easy to vote bill that I offered before the pandemic. It had vote centers and other things in it. But the bigger one that you raise, I think, is, and this is the only thing I asked for this year and didn't get in my bill, was to make the voter registration deadline later. As you noted, under current law, it's 4 weeks. You've got a 4-week window during which you can't register to vote. And ironically, the time when people are the most interested about registering to vote is when you're closer to the election, right? Maybe not ironically. And that's when we cut off people from registering. Last year, of course, we had most of our months, we had a drop in registration. In October, we had a big surge in registration. Even though we only had registration open for like 5 days or something, there was a big bump. I think that we can responsibly extend that deadline later and still have time to prepare for the election, to print the voter rosters for our poll workers and so forth. I think we can do it. I think because we've utilized e-poll books at polling sites for the poll workers, I think we need less time than 4 weeks to upload that data to the e-poll books. So I've been an advocate in two of my two legislative sessions to move that deadline later. And here too, the clerks are just pretty dug in on it. They think it makes their job harder. They're worried about constant changes in the last few weeks before the election of who's on or who's off the rolls. And by the way, let me point out, if you move the deadline to register, you also move the deadline to take people off. Our state law says you can't add or delete anybody for 4 weeks before an election. Well, that also keeps you from taking people who are dead off the rolls or people who move out of state off the rolls before the election. So there's two reasons to move that deadline. One is to get new people, and one is to get rid of old people, dead people, non-residents, people who shouldn't be on our rolls anymore. And so there's two reasons I'd like to see that moved. Unfortunately, right now, it's just not realistic. We'll assess in January if we want to offer that again in the context of another bill. But right now, I don't really see much chance of success on it, unfortunately.
The voter photo ID law that was passed in 2019, that was somewhat, I don't want to say suspended, but that will be in full operation come 22, correct? And give us the context for that in the upcoming.
Well, first it passed in 2020. It was my signature issue, and I'm the one who got it through the legislature. It was implemented last year. We did obviously take account of the reality of the time. We did give a pass to people who were not able to get a photo ID due to COVID, either directly because of exposure or indirectly because of the lines that resulted at clerks' offices that were overrun by people because they had limited hours, they were closed for much of the year. So we had a very limited exception, but we didn't just let people walk in and vote with no ID. We had a lesser form of ID required. So we did implement this law, and let me give you some interesting statistics. We had over 2 million voters vote in this election in November. And the photo ID law went into effect in November. It wasn't in effect in the primary. But in November, we had over 2 million voters vote, and over 2 million voters voted with a photo ID. Out of all of these voters, we only had fewer than 2,000 voters statewide, in the highest turnout we ever had in our history. Only about 2,000 voters voted without a photo ID because they knew the poll worker. And fewer than 800 voters didn't have a photo ID and didn't know the poll worker, and were able to vote because they had what's called in the law a reasonable impediment. They had a reason they couldn't get an ID, whether it was COVID or some other work schedule, whatever it is, they couldn't go get a photo ID, and they were able to vote. They used a different form of ID, a non-approved photo ID or a benefit card or a credit card or what have you, and they were able to vote. But the reason I tell you all this is just to get a sense of perspective. 98% of voters used a driver's license. Another 1% used another form of photo ID. Only 1% didn't vote with the photo ID, and the vast majority of them knew the poll worker. So you're talking about 800 people out of over 2 million that didn't have the ability to produce a photo ID, and they still got to vote. So I think all of the Chicken Little concern about vote suppression with our bill was very misplaced.
Excuse me, I'm mute there. Yeah, I'm sorry, I mentioned 2019, not 2020. It's all a blur, right? Those years kind of meld together. And I'll come back to some of that voter ID concern, because people still have those concerns, and the laws that are being passed now have those restrictions to them. A question about, go ahead, sure.
Can I clarify, our version of photo ID and other states' versions are different. I went out of my way to meet with the ACLU, the League of Women Voters, various left-leaning interest groups that didn't support me and didn't support my bill, and meet with them in advance before we wrote anything and address their concerns proactively. We budgeted $300,000 to give free IDs to poor people. We didn't charge people a poll tax to get a photo ID so they could vote. And I think the best part about that is, even if you don't vote, you get the ID. It helps you open a bank account or get a job. That's a game changer for people. So we didn't take the path that other states have taken with very draconian forms of voter ID that make it difficult to vote. We went out of our way to be maybe the most humane state in the country to require an ID, but also go out of our way to make sure we didn't disenfranchise people.
And some of those arguments around voter photo ID was that there was, I won't say substantial, but there were incidents of in-person voter fraud, but that is minuscule, correct? That Kentucky doesn't have a sweeping problem with in-person voter impersonation.
No, I agree with that. And every year our legislature passes all sorts of laws that are aimed at preventing problems from happening, and this is one of those.
What other kind of reforms? You mentioned some things that you didn't get that you wanted. Are those things you're going to push for in 2022? And what other reforms are you going to ask the legislature to endorse?
Well, the only thing I didn't get that I wanted, and it's pretty mild stuff, but extending the deadline to register to vote. I really do think that we're capable now, especially with our move toward e-poll books. We're capable of in real time updating our voter file and making it more accurate before people vote. So I'd like to see that. If the clerks are dug in against it, then I don't know that I'll bring it up a third time. We'll see. I don't have any more grand designs at the moment for changing our election system. I think we need to let the dust settle. We've had, again, the biggest change in our system we've had in 130 years. And now my job is to go explain to the public what we did and how they benefit and how to use it. And that's going to take, I think, a few election cycles to get people acclimated to all those changes. And I think we need to actually implement this before we try to change it again. It just gets too confusing if you do too much too fast.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on ranked choice voting as a way to better measure voter preference? Do you see it happening in Kentucky ever?
I don't see it happening, and here's why I'm dubious of it. And I'll choose my words carefully here. But in some states, the voters don't have, as they do in Kentucky, the same sort of concerns about the internet and algorithms and so forth. Other states have, again, I'll word this very, very carefully, a higher level of education than Kentuckians do on average. Ranked choice voting is kind of a darling in coastal states with high levels of education, where people are very acclimated to the internet. As I said earlier, in the Northwest, they actually had been voting on the internet for a period of time. I don't think Kentuckians will accept, certainly not in this current environment, but probably in my lifetime either, the notion of moving toward an algorithm to tell us who won the election. There's too much concern that that there's going to be manipulation of the votes, and I just don't see us ever doing that. And the other issue is just it's complicated to have to explain. It's already, gosh, it's already hard enough to get people to fill out a ballot correctly, to not mark two people for the same office where you only get to pick one, to sign in the correct place on their ballot envelope. People make all kinds of mistakes, and I don't want to add another layer of complexity to the voting process, because it disenfranchises people. The more confusing you make this, the less turnout you're going to get and the more mistakes you're going to get, and people are going to disenfranchise themselves.
This question from a participant: why do people have to have an excuse to vote absentee?
Well, so there's kind of two sides of this spectrum, and I'm somewhere in the middle. You've got people that think that no one should ever have to leave their home for anything. You should just sit at home and vote and not go out and vote. And you've got other people that were upset with me for making it safe to vote in a pandemic by voting remotely. And in the middle, you've got 100 years of Kentucky law, and you've got our Constitution. Absentee voting has been a right in our state constitution since 1945. I didn't create absentee voting. I've been voting absentee most of my life. But it's not designed for everybody at all times. In our Constitution, the default is we have voting in person. That is the gold standard. All things being equal, no matter how secure you try to make absentee voting, and we've done a lot on that front, but it's always going to be more secure to have voting in person under the supervision of election officials. I fully support people who are elderly or disabled or out of town voting absentee, but I don't think it's too much to ask people to show up for a few minutes one day or 2 days a year to come participate in our democracy. I also don't have a bunch of free money lying around or money I feel comfortable taking from education or healthcare so I can mail able-bodied people a ballot because they're too lazy to go vote on one of the multiple days we just gave them to vote. So I do think all things being equal, in-person voting is the gold standard, and that's why we have more of it in this bill.
A question on, do you have a suggestion on how you motivate voters to show up and vote? Is that part of your job description?
Well, it's certainly my job to tell them how, but I want to be really careful about what I say, encouraging people to vote, because I'm a Republican, and I want people to think that I'm trying to get my vote out versus the other vote. I'm trying to be as an apolitical politician, as it were. I want to encourage people to participate. Yesterday, I went to Mercer County. They had the only school in the state that managed to register every single one of their eligible students in their school to vote, all of their seniors in their senior class. And so I've tried to do things on the margins to encourage voter registration. I went to the Lexington Legends ballpark for a game night and registered voters there. So we try to do things on the margins, but ultimately it's not really up to me. It's up to the candidates to run campaigns that motivate people to go vote. I do hope that coming out of a pandemic, and again, we had the highest turnout in history in a pandemic. I'm optimistic that it'll go even higher. Once people were able to go out and do voter registration drives, do get out the vote drives in a way they couldn't in 2020, plus all the other mechanisms that we've implemented to make voting easier for people, I do think that we're going to see a big jump in turnout in the next several cycles. But I'm also sensitive that I've got to be a generalized cheerleader, but I got to be really careful in how I do that.
Would you favor changing the deadline for returning absentee ballots from end of voting on election day to several days after the election with postmarks on or before election day? Are you concerned about postal service and citizens in the military based around the world whose ballots may be delayed?
Well, the way most states handle this, and the way, frankly, our state handled this legally before the pandemic, was the votes need to be in on election day or before. We offered some allowances on that in a pandemic because of the delays that we had with the Postal Service. I don't think that we're going to have those on a permanent basis. I think the next time we vote will be fully out of the pandemic and back to normal. So I don't really see a rationale for having the votes coming in after Election Day. Kentucky, one of our traditions that the whole country sees every presidential election, is we're the first or second state in America to report. And I think Kentuckians like being unique. They like having our votes kind of fast. They want to have election results on Election Day. And I don't really see a countervailing reason outside of a pandemic to provide that service.
So let's talk about some national movement here on election laws. And this question, what's your opinion about the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact? It's now passed in a total of 41 state legislative chambers in 24 states. Your thoughts on that?
Well, I certainly think any state has the right to do that. I don't see a constitutional problem with that at all. I don't favor it personally. I don't think Kentucky should cede how our voters feel to how other voters in other states feel. That kind of defeats the entire purpose of having a presidential election by state. If you want to abolish the Electoral College, then go do that. But I don't really favor the midpoint option of us deciding how we're going to vote for president by deferring to California or New York. I think we should make our own decision.
From January 1st till about May 14th, it's been reported that 14 states have passed 22 laws to restrict voting rights, which is a yearly record. In addition, there have been 61 bills that have progressed through legislatures nationwide. There's widespread belief, Mr. Secretary, that these measures are fueled by a false belief that the 2020 presidential election was stolen. Do you agree with that?
I don't agree it was stolen, no. I don't know any election official in America who actually thinks that. But let me make a distinct Sorry, you're on mute there.
Yeah, that's okay. Your response to the legislation that's moving through. Yeah. And, you know, election reform in Kentucky has been to open and expand access, but could also be restricting access beyond, you know, this upcoming year. Who knows, right?
Yeah. Well, let me respond to the first part of that. So first, there's kind of, unfortunately, two polarized schools of thought, and the truth's in the middle. There are some people that think that the election was stolen and they're trying to crack down on access. And there are other people that think everything was totally peachy. The truth is kind of in the middle. You can believe, as I do, that the election was not stolen, but also believe that there were problems. And let me give you something very specific. My counterpart in Pennsylvania, she's been forced out of office. She's not there now, but the Secretary of State at the time in Pennsylvania, her job, my job, is to follow the law. And if you think the law should be changed, you should go and ask and get to be changed. That's what I did. I went to our legislature and asked for authorities by law to make changes. She didn't do that. Instead, she sued the legislature to get the laws overturned that she didn't like. In Pennsylvania, they don't have voter ID in any form, any photo ID, any of that. All they have is verification on ballot envelopes by signature verification. It's the only form of ID they have, and they're mostly vote by mail now. Well, she went to court and got that struck down. So there was no way to determine if the votes were legal or not. Now, does that mean I think they were fraudulent? No, not necessarily. And if they were fraudulent, were they all fraudulent for one candidate? No, not necessarily. But you can see that's a bad look. And you can see why with their legislature and other legislatures in other states would feel they need to react to that kind of situation. So I don't assume that everything was peachy and that states shouldn't improve their systems. We just improved ours. We just banned ballot harvesting. We just made it easier to get the rolls cleaned up. We just moved away from electronic machines, even though we had a secure, fraud-free election. So I don't think that you should set as a premise that we shouldn't update our systems and improve them. The key, though, is there's no reason to limit access in order to enhance your security. And that's why Kentucky's really been different this year. We're the only state to figure this out, that you can actually have both at the same time. You can make it easier to vote and harder to cheat. You don't have to fall down on one side or the other.
So you're aware of the Act. There's a lot of conversation about that. We've talked about that on KET. Mm-hmm. I'm assuming that you don't agree with that measure, but tell us why. And are you concerned that it would override the powers that should be in hands of chief election officials like yourself and on the local level?
Well, if you didn't like the bipartisan cooperation you saw between me and Governor Beshear, if you didn't like the bipartisan cooperation you saw in the legislature that followed our example, then you should be for S1, because it would take away from us our ability to run our own elections and design our own election systems. It would literally strike down the law that we just got passed, that we just got national attention and praise over. I don't think that it would be appropriate if the Republicans won the presidency and Congress for them to pass a Republican national election bill that requires a photo ID to vote and purchase the rolls and all this kind of stuff. Even if I liked individual policies, it would be a bad look to have the national government make the election rules for all the states. The Constitution says it's the job of the state legislatures to do that. And it's a bad look. And if you have, I don't think it's going to pass, but if you had the Democrats in Congress pass through a Democratic version of an election code, make it mandatory on us in all states, I think the individual policies in that bill are not good, but I also think it's just a bad look. The people that think the elections are rigged, they're really going to think that if you take over the election system nationally and strike down our laws in Kentucky that we just passed. So it's just a really bad look. Everything that you're seeing in Texas and other states that are passing these partisan election bills, Nancy Pelosi is condemning that, and she's doing the exact same thing on steroids by trying to pass that times 50 for all 50 states. It's just a terrible idea.
I'll ask you about the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. This is about the pre-clearance, and the Supreme Court struck that down in 2013. Do you have any thoughts about that for states who had a history of racism? Do you think that needs to be reinstated, the pre-clearance?
Well, I don't. One thing I think a lot of folks miss is the DOJ still has authority to bring suit against any state over any change they make to their election system if it has a disparate, certainly an intentional, but even if it's an unintentional impact on voters of a particular race, the DOJ already has authority to sue that state and try to block that practice. They don't need additional authority in another law to do that. The question is, what's the default assumption? Is the default assumption that Georgia is racist and Texas is racist? In which case they have to get pre-clearance to make even a modest change to move a precinct. The most basic changes, including positive changes to their election system, they've got to run through the bureaucracy in Washington under that old part of that act. Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act is still intact. It's not been struck down, and that's good. I want that available to the DOJ if you do have abuse on a racial basis of some part of the electorate. But I don't think that there should be a pre-clearance for states to have to hop through. And I've got no skin in the game because Kentucky was not under the pre-clearance before. Even before part of that act was struck down, I didn't have to go to DOJ and get permission to make it easier to vote or harder to cheat. We got to pass anyway. But you go a few miles south and they were under pre-clearance. And, I think it's real unfortunate. You do have some yahoos, legislators in some states, they offer really awful ideas that would have a racial impact. Like there was a bill in Georgia to ban Sunday voting, which is a day that historically African Americans early vote in Georgia. But it was a real bad look. That bill never passed. I don't think it even got a hearing. But because of the politics of that recommendation, everything Georgia did got painted as that. And so I think a lot of this, frankly, is intentional. I think you have in Congress, they're looking to pick a fight, so they have an excuse to break the filibuster and pass things they want to pass. I think a lot of this is oversold, but look, part of it's just dumb politics on the part of some of these legislators.
This might be the last question. What are your thoughts on redistricting? That'll be an exercise that the General Assembly undertakes next year.
Well, I think it is something that should start as soon as possible. Normally, we get the data from the Census Bureau in the spring, and then that's plenty of time for maps to be drafted. We don't have that data yet. We don't really know what to expect. We know what the population of our state is, but we don't know what it is by county or let alone district or precinct. We expect to get that information this fall. My personal preference is that the governor then call a special session. Here's why. I asked for, I didn't get this, unfortunately, but I did ask the legislature to pass a bill this year to toll the deadline to file for office. Right now, it's the first Friday in January, which is only 4 days after the legislature comes back into session. Under the Constitution, it takes about 5 days to pass a bill. So you're going to have the deadline passed before they could pass a map, even if they came in the very first day and started passing new maps. That disenfranchises people, and it also hurts people from getting their campaign started. They don't know what district they're in. They don't know if they can run for this or that job till that's all figured out. So what I would like to see is bipartisan cooperation between the governor and the legislature for him to call them back in this fall before January and allow the legislature to pass the new maps so that there's public notice to voters and to potential candidates well in advance of the deadline in January so people can make good decisions.
Do you support the idea of having a third-party independent commission to draw those lines?
No, I don't think so. The folks that are calling for an independent commission weren't calling for that in the 100 years when Democrats redistricted and ran the legislature. We've seen a lot of brinksmanship and gamesmanship by Democrats when they ran the legislature to write people out of districts and try to hurt Republicans. And I don't think the Republicans are going to be as vicious with their authority. But I don't think it's fair that Republicans, for the first time in 100 years, get a chance to write laws that they're entitled to act on under our Constitution and the federal Constitution, to take that away when the Democratic Party had it for 100 years. That's not really fair. If you want to make a commission, then great, but make it retroactive 100 years. That's how to be fair with that.
Very well. Okay, I think we'll leave it there, Secretary Adams. I appreciate your time, and I know the Louisville Forum does as well, and we'll be in touch. And I'll yield the floor back to Mr. Keith Larson.
Thank you so much, Secretary Adams, and thank you, Renee, for such a great program. On behalf of the Louisville Forum, we thank you for joining us today. Our next meeting, like we mentioned earlier, is going to be on Wednesday, July 21st at Vincenzo's. That's the third Wednesday of July. We will be emailing information on registration in advance and dues and those sort of topics. We'll be sending an email like that here in the next week or so. Our topic is going to be, should critical race theory be taught in our schools? We're working on putting a panel together right now, and it promises to be a lively debate. With that, we conclude our June program, and thank you everyone for attending.